Welcome everybody. We're gonna get started. I'm not gonna use the mic because I'm pretty loud already. Hi, I'm Jeremy. I'm the director of the honors program here at SVA, and I'm really pleased to welcome everyone to the winter return on a perhaps somewhat gloomy, rainy winter day. Too warm for a winter day. Return of the Art and Politics lecture series for the winter-spring semester. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. I will send around a sign-up sheet, so please just sign in if you can, so we know everyone is here, and all the wonderful human beings hopefully benefiting from our excellent programming tonight. I won't take too long by way of introduction, but just in terms of the series, the Art and Politics lecture series is co-hosted by the honors program at SVA and the Visual and Critical Studies program, chaired by my colleague Tom Hoon, and we aim to think about kind of the many crises facing humanity in the present moment, crises of economy, crises of racial justice, crises of the climate, maybe most especially, crises of democracy, and their relationship to art, the ways in which art and politics both do overlap and don't overlap, and how to somehow, in contradictory fashion, occasionally perhaps think them together. That's the mission of the lecture series. At the end, I'll say a little bit more about what we have coming up, but so as not to drain any enjoyment further, I will hand it over. I'll introduce briefly and then hand it over to our speaker for the evening. I'll say, I first read Ben Davis's first book, 9.5 Theses, yes? Just always making sure. 9.5 Theses on Art and Class. Some years ago, I remember quite specifically where I read it because of how much I liked it. I think it's a sign of how much you like a book that you remember actually the situation in which you read it. So I was reading it in the Rose Reading Room at the New York Public Library and taking copious notes and discovering quite a lot in it. And I think there's maybe no better primer in some ways to thinking about in a punchy, sometimes polemical, but always deeply thoughtful way, some of the relationships between class, politics, and art in the contemporary scene. That book is now followed by a new book, The Art in the Afterculture, Capitalist Crisis and Cultural Strategy. And this just came out from Haymarket Press quite recently. And it again represents, I think, an attempt to come to terms with contemporary art, broadly, trends in contemporary art, and the way in which capitalist society, class politics, and the general crises of our period affect what the discourse of the arts, like how we think and talk about the arts, the ways in which we misapprehend the moment we're living in, and what possibilities there might be beyond this moment in both art and politics. So I think it's a book I heartily recommend. After the event, we do have some copies. It's published by an independent publisher, Haymarket Books, so I strongly encourage, and also just because having real books is good so you can remember where you read them, like I just gave that story, I encourage people to pick one up. We have them for $10. Which you can give to me after the lecture. But that's later. Now, let's all please give a very warm welcome to Ben Davis.
Thank you, Jeremy. I will use the mic. Is that too loud? Is it good? It's good, okay. It's good. Well, God, what a feeling of I'm flattered and terrified to be here in front of you. In the book, I talk a little bit about this concept of context collapse, which people talk about in social media, about how you what happens when you speak and you don't know what exact community you're speaking to, what audience it is. And I feel a little bit that right now, that I don't know exactly who I'm speaking with. There are very accomplished people in this room, and I don't know exactly what concerns or issues are going to be flying at me. So I'm going to speak briefly. I'm going to try and hit it down the middle. We'll see where we land, and it might come out a little rough, but we'll clean it all up in the discussion. So just to say thank you for being here. It is, most of the time being a writer is very isolating. It's an experience of sort of screaming into the screen and not knowing if anybody hears you. So it's moving to me to see so many people come out on a cold Monday evening to talk about to see a talk with such an esoteric title that doesn't really explain itself. Art in the Afterculture is a little less than a year old. It is a little bit hard for me to present on and to summarize because it's a collection of essays. It grows out of things that I've written about as an art critic in the last 5 years, thinking about how art is changing, how my relationship to art as a writer is changing, and what art might look like in the near future. So what I was thinking, the audience I was imagining here, thinking about is people who are concretely engaged with the problems of being an artist now. And so I wanted to just leave you with maybe 2 points or themes that I think are clear if you read the book, but bubble underneath a number of the different chapters as a sub-theme or motif or something that orients the way I think about it, and to see if they're helpful as guideposts. So the first theme, and this comes in at the beginning in the chapter I have a chapter about connoisseurship and the history of art. It comes in chapter 3, which is about how social media has changed art, and chapter 4, which is about how artificial intelligence, the conversation about artificial intelligence in art, is this idea that we're living through a kind of a breakdown in the idea of the art world as a frame of reference, the art world in quotes. And maybe that seems like a sort of a esoteric subject, but I think it's important to you as art makers or art thinkers. You're trying to make meaning and find an audience, and the art world is a kind of imagined community a term that we use very casually, an imagined community that we orient on as we think about the project of trying to find an audience. So, what does it mean? What's the nature of the breakdown of the art world as a frame of reference as it appeared in the book? So what is an art world? So there's an essay from 1972 by Lawrence Alloway, a critic and curator from Art Forum, called Network, the Art World Described as a System, that's very influential on me, where he tries to think about what an art world is or how it functions. And one of the things that he says there that's very thought-provoking for me as a writer is he says, you can't really define the art world or an idea of an art world. It's not about art production, because you can be making art in a cabin in the woods, or you could be making art in your apartment just for yourself, and you're not really part of an art world. An art world is defined by the institutions of circulation. The galleries and museums that show art and circulate discourse around art, and the publications that generate ideas around art. And it's these special institutions that kind of put a special lens on art, talk about art as a special subject with a certain kind of special texture and importance that gives a sense of an art world, that there's a community to orient on that exists as a sort of special space. And I think that it's pretty clear that in the recent past, both of these institutions of circulation, because of the transformation in the attention economy and media culture, are under various forms of pressures and transformations, and in ways that are really disorienting and have come on pretty fast. In the realm of museums, to take a comic example, you think about the immersive Van Gogh experience, which was ubiquitous 2 years ago, and in the immediate post-pandemic period, and it's pretty silly, but on the other hand, it may be the most visited art exhibition of all time. By some measures, it's Ticketmaster's biggest selling attraction of that year, outselling, the Taylor Swift. as an attraction. And it is, after all, an attempt to create like a form of art experience with no art and no artist involved. It is a completely disorienting kind of phenomenon to analyze. And there were all these kinds of for-profit art institutions that have popped up responding to the expectations about culture, culture being interactive and responsive, or culture being Instagrammable, and sort of sets, new kinds of set-like experiences in the last few years that kind of exist outside of the art world as a legitimate and frame, but are art-like, and are clearly putting different kinds of pressures on what people expect of art and how institutions think about themselves. Because art institutions, after all, are very, they're nonprofits who are kind of like constantly hustling for cash in general. So now, the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, the official Van Gogh Museum, is opening its own immersive experience. I think there is a real transformation in how people relate to art. There was, a few years ago, in 2016, I visited this art experience called Meow Wolf in Santa Fe. People familiar with it? You really should be. Very rare as an art critic do you get to make a prediction that comes so true. When I saw it, I wrote, this is a kind of experience that it will very rapidly spread from the margins to become mainstream. It's like an interactive, almost kind of haunted house experience. And it is the most popular tourist attraction in Santa Fe, in New Mexico. And I was just in Las Vegas, and there are like billboards for it, where it's an art installation that is presented on the same level as the Adele residency or Chris Angel Mind Freak. And that is a new kind of phenomenon. And these are all for-profit experiences that exist, have started in the kind of margins of what we think about art and are putting pressure on the center. But I actually, I don't want to focus on the institutional piece. I want to focus on the circulation of writing piece, how the institutions of media about art has changed and are changing, because that's, most intimate to me as someone who writes about art. And anyone who does write about art, I think, has felt this, a real intensification of, anyone who writes period online has felt like a real intensification of the alienation, disorientation around the business of writing in the last 10 years. In the book, in chapter 3, I briefly tell the story of BuzzFeed and its founding. And that is a slightly now fallen reference, fallen from grace reference. But it's important to me because BuzzFeed really did pioneer the model of mining kind of viral culture as business, and also because it started as an art project. And I think that's I'm always interested in things that start as art projects and become something that's unrecognizable as them. In 2005, Jonah Peretti, who founded BuzzFeed, and his sister Chelsea Peretti, the comedian from Brooklyn Nine-Nine, did an art show at the New Museum called Contagious Media. And in that show, it was a show that curated together basically the memes of the day. Memes that are so old now that they're like from the Cretaceous period, as far as this audience is concerned, like the dancing baby from Ally McBeal, and the Hot or Not website. And basically the show was asking, within the framework of the museum, what if we treat these, doesn't matter, what if we treat these as art? What are they? These are art-like things. And the curator frames them in the tradition of like 60s conceptual art. This is a new thought at that time period. But the important thing about the show was not the show itself, which was critically panned, but they organized something called the Contagious Media Showdown coming out of it, where they took all these online art projects and memes and they pitted them against each other in like a race for attention online to see who would get the most clicks. And the winner was something called the Forget Me Not Panties, which were like Wi-Fi enabled underwear. And it was with the attention generated by the Contagious Media Showdown amongst advertisers, marketers, and media pundits that Joni Peretti was able to leverage that interest into creating BuzzFeed, which kind of took this idea of mining the fascinations of internet culture into an entire very aggressive business model. And in talking about it, Joni Peretti has the following quote, which chills me to read even now. He said, "If you want to look at the entries in the Contagious Media Showdown as art or entertainment or social commentary, it is possible to think a project is great, even if it is not popular. But for the Showdown, the ultimate yardstick is traffic." And that is an experience that anyone who works in the media has lived through. This kind of new experience of writing where everything, the quantification of quality on a new level, where everything is immediately comparable in numerical terms. You probably even experience this interpersonally, and like you're probably very aware of the real-time social stock market, who's getting clicks and likes, and so on, who's up, who's down, and it's something, I remember very vividly the moment with my work life when we got the big screen in our office that compares in real time, everything on the website that is trafficking. And what this does is it breaks down the old model of content where there's this very specific single filter. You look at things, now everything is consumed in a feed and competing against itself, and competing against each other in new terms for attention. And that means that art coverage is the stuff that rises to the surface in terms of online art coverage is the stuff that circulates best online. That is, it's pre-existing narratives about fame and success around it, or its relationship to controversy, and the more local aspects of it, the in-gallery, personal situated stuff. That stuff doesn't have as much traffic, and you can see that much traction. You can see that in a newly vivid way in this kind of context. And then also, every piece of art content is competing with lots of art-like stuff. The kind of stuff there's in the Contagious Media Showdown, all kinds of viral, fascinating stuff that are almost like art in various kinds of ways, and that produces this new texture. And for art, it's sort of similar. The effects have sort of been similar to how movie stars have been replaced by influencers as role models for young people in our fashion magazine covers. There's a lot of online art-like stuff that is crowded into the art space. I see there's much more new writing when you look at to the future of media as I perceive it. Much more new writing about online culture, the category, than art. When I talk to newer writers, I sort of perceive that the role model of choice has moved from, this is a very wonky comparison, but this is the world I live in, is that the online role model of choice has moved from being Roberta Smith to Taylor Lorenz. So Roberta Smith is the art critic for the New York Times, probably the most important art critic in the United States. Taylor Lorenz also used to work for the New York Times and is a web culture reporter. She is most famous for writing the article about the OK Boomer meme that enraged baby boomers everywhere. And it is, what is important to me about this comparison or this transition in mindsets, that it's not just about what people write about writing about art in the more narrow lens of a specific field versus writing about more general culture. There's a little difference in what these two figures do. Roberta Smith looks at things that are coming up through the art system, and kind of nominates them for attention. Nominates them for attention in a historical conversation going forward. Whereas generally, what someone who writes about online culture like Taylor Lorenz is doing is looking at things that have already been selected by the algorithm, that have already people are talking about, and essentially decoding after the fact how something that what something that has become popular means and why. No, I don't think this doesn't mean sort of cutthroat war of all against all attention economy. It doesn't mean that art doesn't have a place. In Louis Vuitton, which is the biggest luxury goods concern in the world, just had some kind of installation about Yayoi Kusama, including like a robot that everybody's talking about. But it does mean that it's harder to break in as an artist outside of the frameworks of fame or controversy. And that is like part of a rule of this media terrain. That is, I say all this with the very real sense that we're in a bit of a vibe shift in relationship to this kind of media moment. I think that the way I think about it is like a decade of viral content has built up a lot of viral content antibodies in the audience. Like people are pretty suspicious of clickbait and how their emotions are manipulated and so on. But I do contend it is a material relationship. It is a material change in how the media works. And so the way people often phrase it is a kind of a very moralistic, we just need to get back to real values. But it is, and particularly when you work in the media, you really feel this is about modes of sustenance, about how the actual business works, how people's attention works, and also, frankly, what an audience demands or wants, or wants. And that I think that firmly believe that the artistic project of the near future will be kind of building conscious communities of affiliation that exist in opposition or outside of the kind of trending conversation. That's a major cultural project of the near future, a return to some kind of situated community. But that's a real organized. It's actually a project of like actually organizing a community with a specific local meaning, and it's not just an intellectual project. Now, there's an aside to this. There are 2 points and 2 asides, which is that every time someone says something about how anything about art is threatened or is in crisis or whatever, someone will always say it's always been that way. It's always stuff on the rise, always stuff passing away, which is so true it's meaningless. And you hear this a lot in the current conversation about AI, that there's a lot of panic about like the incursion of AI into the creative fields and writing. And then in response to that, there'll always be someone who says, well, AI is just a tool. It's just like photography. When photography appeared, people were like, it's gonna kill painting. But painting found new things to do, and photography eventually became an art of its own, so art's not gonna die. And I think, there's some truth to that. But I really think that a historical way of thinking about our present and the past has to be find some way between like the kind of catastrophism, like art is dead way of thinking about things, and its opposite number, which is the kind of like jaded, 'twas ever thus kind of way of thinking. Because, real forms of art that we care about can die, in various forms of technological transitions, and arguably the entire reason why arts exist within a lot of the visual arts conversation exists within the nonprofit frame is because there are things that we believe that we should set up structures to value outside of the direct market relationship that just kind of crushes everything to its most popular and marketable possible thing. I mean, there are, vaudeville used to be a very important art. Popular urban theater was a very big thing. The recorded media kind of killed it off. Right now, mid-budget movies are kind of dying. Mid-budget movies, where a lot of the artistic aspirations of Hollywood filmmaking reside, but the attention economy of now does not sustain them. Anything between a blockbuster movie and a kitchen sink indie are kind of like dying. That's the first point. The second theme in the book that I want to give you as a starting proposition is I think there's a lot of thinking in the book. The second chapter, which is on elite capture, a term I take from Olufemi Taiwo from his great book, Elite Capture, which everyone should read. The fifth chapter, which is on online organizing, a little bit the last chapter on the environmental crisis, is thinking about art and cultural production as a form of historic capture and deflection of political energy. Thinking through that problem historically. So, what does that mean? For me, I'm sort of throwing out things that I learned in writing the book, rethought about. This is kind of was me rethinking how I'd been taught art history when I was studying, or when I was training as a docent, actually, at the Walker Art Center some 20 years ago now. I think the kind of art industry that we know today is really a creature of the 60s. When art becomes a little bit less elite and concerned with like a specific dialogue with tradition, and a little bit more focused on dialogue with popular culture. In the United States, that's pop art and conceptualism, and that has a political element of it too. The new dialogue with the popular opens up a pathway to like art as a political project. Lucy Lepard, who's one of my favorite critics, wrote, in the 1950s and 1960s, it didn't even occur to most professional U.S. artists that their art could be used not only for aesthetic pleasure or decoration or status symbols, but also as an educational weapon. In 1972, this is a story, very famous story that probably everyone here knows, but I retell it in the book, and I'll tell it again here. Hans Haacke, the artist Hans Haacke, did a work at the Guggenheim, Sapolsky et al., a real-time system as of May 1st, 1952. And it's a very famous work of art that's essentially a kind of a work of journalism, or data journalism, where he looks at an infamous slumlord and shows the connections of some of his interests. And this was a very controversial show in 1972. It was like the curator organized it was fired, and people protested outside the museum. And the Guggenheim infamously described as an alien body inside the museum. It's like, in other words, it was very unusual to have that kind of material in the museum. It was something that felt like it really didn't belong. But now I think that kind of use of art as a kind of a progressive, consciousness-raising thing, is a very mainstream genre or form of art. There's a textbook called Art Since 1900. People familiar with it? That was very influential a few years ago, and it's in 2 volumes, and essentially one is kind of pre-60s, basically pre-60s, the second is post-60s. And then in the pre-60s period, they're basically talking about the European and American avant-gardes as formal experimentation, driving things forward in terms of formal experimentation. In the post-1960s period, the argument of the book is that formal experimentation stops being as important as critical experimentation, as producing critical culture and political culture. The forward narrative of art history is assumed by politics in the post-60s period in this account. And I'm sure you're familiar with this. You're artists or aspiring artists, and I'm sure people tell you all the time in SVA, don't just be decorative. You want to engage with, you want a critical practice. You want to engage with the world as you should. That's one of the reasons why people become artists, because they have something to say about the world. But the question for me became and becomes like how I reconcile this narrative of art about the forward motion of politics into art, the use of biennials and museums as a progressive political platform, and the other narrative, obvious narrative of the last 50 years, which is of neoliberalism, of the disintegration of the post-war social contract, of the spiking of inequality, the destruction of organized labor and unions, the rollback of civil rights. Like, politics became much more conservative at the same time art became much more liberal openly. Like, that's to me like a very one of those contradictions you identify when Marxists are always talking about identifying the contradictions. So how do we reconcile this? There are French sociologists, Yves Chiapello and Luc Boltanski. One of the things they do is they look at the countercultural movements and the political movements of the 1960s. And they see in them that there are really two things going on, what they call the political critique and the cultural critique. And the political critique is like, for equal rights and redistribution of political power and wealth. And the cultural critique is like that culture is alienating and harsh, alienating and deaf to the forms of people's forms of expression and desire, unrepresentative. And their point is that these things overlap and sometimes seem like the same thing, but that they're actually different things. They can be disarticulated. And their idea about what happens coming out of the 1960s is that essentially, late 1960s is a time of extreme political and cultural crisis. I mean, in a way that we haven't really known. So there had to be some kind of restabilization. And one of the ways this happened was a carrot and a stick thing. People sidelined the political demands and incorporated the cultural demands. So your boss maybe listens to rock and roll. He probably doesn't wear a hat. He probably doesn't wear a tie. But work life, world gets much more unequal, and you probably, if you had a union, you probably kiss that goodbye, or you're probably working in a new service sector that's ununionized. The way sometimes political people talk about this is that after the 60s, political people talk about it. I've not heard it much talked about in the kind of artistic realm. That the right got economics and politics, and the left got culture and academia, which is very striking. Because if you're like a lot of the movements in the 1960s were very inspired by Marxism. So essentially that means, in vulgar Marxist terms, the right got the base, the left got the superstructure. There is some people in here in a study group about Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, with me, and so I was just thinking about Gramsci. He talks about how ruling classes don't rule just with force; they rule with a combination of force and consent, with violence and coercion, trying to buy people, to give people a little something. And you can sort of think about this, that there was an awful lot of violent repression in this time period. I mean, Black Panthers killed in their beds, as probably everybody knows. But at the same time, there was this cultural process, and that is part of this hegemonic restabilization of society, where some of those energies were channeled off the street into these individual cultural forms of action. There's also an incredible explosion of nonprofit activity in this period that redirects social energy from the streets and into professionalized forms, and the explosion of art nonprofits is part of that. To the point now that I think that we're all so part of that. It's so part of everything we've been raised in, that whenever there's a political crisis or social crisis, I think anybody who's a cultural person will be bombarded with material that's essentially how can art help? Now is the time, artists to the bat, we need you more than ever. And I guess I just have come through this research in this book to wondering whether maybe that's a trap. Maybe that obscures the question of where power really is in society and keeps us from asking that by channeling people in these kind of individual cultural projects and away from the kind of some of the collective projects that are really important in the 1960s. And I guess another way to put this is that the fact that my book is sort of, Marxist book, and I'm here at an art school speaking, and that's not a big deal, and that is much more natural than to be a Marxist in a trade union organizing setting, is a striking and important fact of the recent political and cultural period, and that we should view it as the result of a historical compromise that falls upon us to escape. Second aside, my note on that is that some of that's going to sound obvious, because I think there is a lot of cynicism about art politics now There's a lot of cynicism about virtue signaling and so on. This is one of the effects of the hyper-commodification of contemporary expression and culture, is that everybody is constantly viewing everybody else as performing a position for clout or clicks and likes and so on. But the perspective that I'm trying to put forward in the book is a historical one. I'm trying not to, I'm not saying, like that art politics stuff, that's not real. What I'm saying is that we are in a weak position. It's a weak position for so much of left energy to be focused in culture, in cultural and academic spaces, and so little, elsewhere. And then that is we have to look at that as that's the reality of the situation we're in, but it's something that we need to break out of. And again, it's a practical organizing problem. It's not an intellectual problem. So, final thought before we go to a discussion where we can get into more fine-grained detail. You may have noticed, the alert viewer may have noticed that these two theses are in contradiction or tension with each other. That the art world, the one is that the art world is being decomposed and sort of losing traction as this sort of like standalone, bubble-like, comfortable terrain, and the other one is about art being absorbed, the art's function as a buffer or social cushion or bubble or playpen or whatever you want to call it, place there where social energy gets trapped. And I think that the fact that those two things are both operational is one of the things that makes this moment to me feel very disorienting. That those two things are happening at once, kind of together. And I think you can put them together in two different ways. And the one is, I think it's true that, to a certain extent, some of the problems of art politics that I was writing about in my last book 10 years ago, in the ensuing time period, because of the massive distribution of communication power through consumer gadgetry and social media and so on, have become much more general cultural problems. That it's like that cultural producer is one of the fastest growing economic categories. It is soaking up a lot of people's aspirations is to become a content producer of all kinds, which has, which has these same problems of having a social project, having your aspirations channeled in these very individualistic forms of affiliation and production. So in some ways, there's an opportunity there for some of the thinking that's been done about art politics and art thinking to have like a much wider relevance. Art's in competition with all these new forms of things that are like near art or culture exist in new forms of cultural networks. But at the same time, there are conversations that have been had in art about the stakes of the politics of expression that are suddenly have a chance to have a wider relevance, form new kinds of arrangements and solidarities with with a newly broad type of people. I mean, there's like so many. YouTube or influencer. These are the top aspirational categories for young people at this point. And there's a lot of historical experience and knowledge within the art community about the stakes of performing your life as an art project and the limits of it and so on. Now if you flip it over, I think you can also say the art world is sort of disintegrating as a standalone, set-aside form of lens. But what that means is also that this historic compromise, we're at the end of that kind of period of a historic compromise in a certain kind of a way. That for a long time period, if you look at academia and culture as being where a lot of the energy of the 1960s went and was absorbed into, all those institutions, essentially all the institutions that you can assume are kind of by default left of center progressive, are in disintegration. Academia is in full disintegration, particularly academic humanities. Media is in crisis. Museums are in crisis. So what we're seeing is the end of the period where that shock absorber functions well. That its ability to kind of take the edge off social conflict by having that kind of hegemonic operation where we offer you the glamour of a cultural career in exchange for not talking too much about bigger social or structural things. The ability that I don't think the system really has that in it anymore, and I think that explains a lot of the conversation in the present. I mean, you really do see new things. You see some people no longer college educated, people no longer able to identify themselves in these institutions, going alt-right, going hard right, forming new kinds of affiliations between radical right politics and cultural production. And then you see new kinds of organizing in museums. I mean, a historically unprecedented kind of like cultural a wave of museum organizations, people thinking about, the myth of the creative economy, where it's like, in exchange for a semi-rewarding, in exchange for being able to like feel like good about that you have a creative, cool job, we can pay you nothing, like that's at an end. Like people are done with that myth. And you really see people finding, looking to new kinds of solidarities and forming new kinds of communities. And then you have people building new art worlds in communities that I don't even know about. I feel like, to sum up, I start, the book at the end of the day leaves me with a series of starting points for a bunch of questions that I can't solve individually, but I hope are useful in having a conversation that we can have collectively and solve collectively. So for that reason, I'm very excited to begin the conversation with you about what all this might mean. Thank you very much. Okay. So we have until 8, right? Yeah. Plenty of time for conversation and should I leave 10 minutes at the end for books, or should I go till 8 and then?
We can go to, we'll see what the room wants.
Okay, read the room. What do we want to talk about? Yeah.
I'd like to know if your point of view is very American.
Sure.
Okay? And you didn't mention that, but I felt it, and it seems to be the case. So therefore, that has some impact on how you define culture. Okay? Because lately, until the last 2 or 3 years, I was going to Asia a lot, and they have a very, very different idea of culture than we do. And the same for the Europeans. They have a different history, okay? And the meaning of culture is very, very different. How do you define culture in terms of some of your concerns?
How do I define culture? It's my turn. My concern. Well, I suppose. Well, first of all, nothing to add on the American centric. That's just true. Yeah. That's just true. And I think that. Look, this is a project of unlearning. I learned a certain kind of art history. I try and broaden my focus, but it's a project of unlearning. That I've done a lot of in this book. I sort of learning in public. I try and tell the story. I think an important. An important sort of narrative I tell very briefly in the book, in the first chapter, is, I think there's obviously the greatest examples of art's role as imposing kind of alien ways of life on other people are in colonial contexts, where people are European powers impose their ideas of art on them, the kind of like individualistic, freestanding European art object kind of idea. But at the same time, it's sort of interesting that it's also in those contexts that it has the most radical significance, because it's there where like a lot of colonial intellectuals in Iraq and Nigeria and India can also claim the role of like artist as intellectual, as no, you say that I'm not an individual. I am an individual that has political significance in those contexts in a way it doesn't always in our terrain where art is, the kind of creative individual is more of the default, and almost like a very commodified dream that's being held out to people. How do I define culture in the sense of these, in the sense of, I'm trying to think of a way to answer that usefully. Culture, art are very notoriously slippery things to talk about, so I guess I would say that I can't escape a sort of institutional definition of art, like starting from the institutions that define it in our context, museums and magazines and so on, and that's why I think as those institutions change, our definitions of culture and how culture circulates change. How would you answer the question?
Well, I think that we're in a situation now where people want to escape their culture. For example, right now I think a lot is going on in Korea. Okay, I think that is the place that people are looking at. Okay, and I have heard some of these artists say, "I'm not a Korean artist. I'm an artist." Okay, that means let's get rid of our culture and we'll go for money.
We'll go for what?
For money.
Okay.
Okay, that's the way I take that. Okay, I don't know if these people would see it the same, but and I've heard this elsewhere in the Middle East. I mean, it's incredible. People don't want to be attentive to how they were raised, who they are, who their families were. They just want to be an artist. Okay. So, but what does that mean? Just wanting to be an artist in terms of culture, okay? Is culture no longer important? That's the second question that I would ask you.
Is culture no longer important? No, I think it's very important. I think that, so in terms of those terms, the story I tell in the first chapter of the book is I really think that, I don't know about, I do kind of agree with the Raymond Williams thoughts about culture as, the term culture takes on its modern significance when you have like capitalism and then you need to define some kind of sphere that is opposed to the alienations of the market. And that's kind of how I view, the story I try and tell in the beginning of the book is about art, the term art, and how it emerges from some of those contradictions too, about how in our European American context, or in the European American, the term, what always strikes me with the idea of art and the term artist, is that they are just basically defined as the inversion of capitalist alienation, and they emerge in the Romantic period as a kind of like shadow of them, that like and everything that people want out of art is kind of the shadow of the commodity. It's like you want something that you know where it came from, who did it. You have like a sense of individuality in a world that's very flattened of individuality, and I think that has different articulations in different spaces, different cultural spaces. But I do think that is, in my research, semi-continuous with different historical articulations in different places going through capitalist development. Just a story I briefly tell in the thing, and in the story in the book. Is that concept of art important to me? Yes, but it is also a trap. And that is just be vulgar or just use a bit of jargon. It's dialectical. It can both contain all these political aspirations within it. In terms of like a lot of people become artists because they want to escape the alienation that they experience otherwise. It is the escape valve within the world we live in that holds out that promise of having being treated like an individual essentially. But that is imbricated with I think because of the hyper commodification of culture, people are continuously having those dreams beaten out of them So it is important to. I mean, I would defend those ideas. There's this tremendous flattening of culture. On the other hand, I do think it is very hard, and it is one of the difficulties of the conversation, to defend that idea of art without relapsing into some form of elitism, something that essentially sounds like elitism. And you just have to live within that contradiction, because you can't solve that contradiction intellectually. It's a material problem about like who has power and money and how like agency is distributed in society. And while it is very satisfying to take the position that it's like what Boltanski and Chappelle call the cultural critique, that like capitalism is bad because it alienates culture. It's like that is the culture that most people live with, and if you're as a political project, you have to be in dialogue with those forms of energy as well. And it's just, I don't think that there's a neat way to resolve that contradiction, you know.
Earlier you mentioned context collapse. And to me, the capitalist formulation of context collapse is breaking into new markets, right? And I might just be reformulating what you're saying, but capitalism seems to really like this leveling, as you said, of sort of, we don't want a particular audience, we want the broadest audience possible, right? And Warhol actually said, like, one of the things that is kind of strange and great about a can of Coke is that it has absolutely no elitism stuck to it, right? They're all the same, they're equally good. It's a kind of a weird democratization, right? The Queen of England can't get a special Coke. It's the same, right, as anybody else, you know, that can purchase it. And, you know, and he was a kind of an apostle of that sort of leveling, right? But then, you know, like, as you said, there is also this very, you know, breaking into new markets, levels communities, it degrades institutions, right? And there are some forms of artistic experience that can't, like, you couldn't have immersive Morandi. Right. I mean, you could try, right? But it wouldn't work, right? You know? And so, yeah, I mean, I guess I just want to sort of push it further into, like, in the context of context collapse, how you would...
Well, I think, this kind of connects to what we were just talking about. I mean, I think capitalism, the market economy, whatever you want to call it, has a leveling effect, but doesn't just have a leveling effect, is constantly regenerating. Because the leveling effect of capitalism drives down the profit margins of all things, you know? So if you're Pepsi versus Coke, one of them has to then invent like luxury Pepsi for some reason. Or even if you're Coke against generic cola, Coca-Cola is the luxury version of that. You're constantly creating new moats around your commodities in order to charge a premium. I quote David Harvey on this in the book, in the first chapter. Like it is not true that capitalism is only about the leveling effects. As a matter of fact, the most richest person in the world at this hour is Bernard Arnault, who is a luxury goods guy. I mean, that is a very powerful form of capitalism, is the generation of new forms of specialness feeling. And it is, and I think, you know, I think one of the things that characterize the cultural present in my assessment is this very intensification of alienation, because, I mean, for many, many reasons, but, you know, a stereotype or stock one would be like social media. Like our interpersonal lives are very commodified now. One of the things that means, is I talk about this in the cultural appropriation chapter in the book, one of the things that means it's very hard for people to have a sense of like meaningful subcultures for more than 2 seconds before some marketer hops on top of it and takes it away from you. And that does have the effect of destroying people's sense of ego, and is causing people, I think explains some of the cultural and political pathology of the moment. It's like people trying to reinvent senses of community violently in a situation where there's such a violently appropriate of capitalism. I think in the book that explains some of the pathologies of left-wing online discourse. It's a whole other story. I think it explains some of the cultural appropriation conversation if you approach it sympathetically. There's like people, like having the continuous experience of feeling like situated cultures being like strip mined for parts. And it explains, in my opinion, a lot of the appeal of conspiracy theory and like esoterica and stuff in the present moment is that you have to continuously find things that are in some way resistant to the continuous leveling effect that everyone experienced psychically, and that because it's just we're in such a berserk moment. It's like a continuously pushing people further and further and further and further out there, capital. Gosh, the NFT conversation was like all about that, wasn't it? Last year, it's like people who just, I think in one of the New York Times articles, like people are desperate for forms of specialness and affiliation, and they're willing to like put a lot of money in like these essentially, it drives people towards scams and cults and all that kind of stuff. More to be said about that, yeah.
I have to go old school on you.
Go.
One who brought up base and superstructure, and seemingly most of your arguments remain in the superstructure. Given you brought up David Harvey also, how do you understand that it's all occurring because there are significant changes taking place in the base? And that the real crisis is this crisis of the superstructure because base relationships are changing.
Well, I mean, I guess I should say that I'm not I tend to agree that base superstructure is a metaphor with like limited utility in some situations, and not like I mean, there's a reason why people got away from talking about it in a really mechanical way. And about the time neoliberalism set in, actually, in 1977, Raymond Williams says, like superstructure is a metaphor and it's a bad one. Because it became increasingly clear that culture was industry. Like it was just like a sort of a silly thing to talk about the culture as like, I think the thing that Williams talks about is like, in Marx's day, you're talking about a piano player versus a manufacturer of piano, but now it's like it's a huge industry in like popular music in a way that there just wasn't in that time. So it's just like kind of ridiculous to think about the base structure in these orthodox sense. I mean, it's a really great question. I mean, it's without exceeding the scope of I think you're developing an entire theory of contemporary capitalism. I mean, I would say in a nutshell that, I think that what I have come to, and particularly in the cultural appropriation chapter, for me was like really like trying to figure out, really took me in this path of like trying to figure out how does culture work now, and what are the pressures on people in a way. And one of the things I think is obvious is that the kind of cultural contract of the last 30 or 40 years has been for middle class people, in the United States, or aspiring middle class people, has been in the 1950s it was the affluent society. In the 1990s it's the creative society. It's essentially like, and it plays an ideological function because it's like, don't worry about the manufacturing stuff. Your kids can have much cooler jobs. And we'll do you'll do the design stuff. You'll have the bohemian stuff. You'll we'll leave the polluting manufacturing stuff. We can relocate that. You don't have to worry about that level of alienation. That's a very old cultural contract in the United States. It's a very famous letter from John Adams that's like, I should teach my children politics and war so that they could teach their children, naval engineering so that they could teach their children poetry and ceramics. Like the idea that one generation is sacrificing the next generation could have like a less alienated, more creatively fulfilling life. It has a lot of appeal as an ideology. The problem is, and this is the moment we live in now, is that that you need a lot of it's a scam. A lot of it's a scam based on the idea of when you look under the hood of the art economy. I always say an artist is actually, the term artist actually contains three things in it. It's like people who make a living off their art, which is what we usually think about as an artist. People who are aspirationally artists but have a job elsewhere, and are supported by like a spouse or a friend or a grant or whatever, and then rich people. And people don't really talk about that in terms of the creative economy, and so it's become an ideology that's been used to sell a lot of self-exploitation for people for a couple generations in a way that's really bubbled over now. I mean, I think people are done with that, and that really characterizes our moment. I mean, is that a crisis of base or superstructure? They're metaphors and they're integrated. So I don't really know. What do you think? Yeah.
I think it's real. I don't think it's a metaphor. I think the material base is, because of technology and so on, is significantly transforming. The requirement for labor is transforming. The circulation of values that need to be circulated in the superstructure have to change in order for capitalism to survive. Otherwise, because we are talking about a crisis of capital, and my understanding of culture is the circulation of value and criterion standards. And as such, the present set of standards and values and criteria that is circulating in the superstructure do not support the emerging base.
That's right. I just don't know. I mean, I don't know how I prize them apart. It's a conversation for the bar for afterward. I mean, they're like huge things. Jeremy, do you want to say something, or do you want someone behind you?
I did have a question.
Oh, yeah.
I have a couple questions. So one was, I thought it was interesting, in your last book, the question of like art as a form of labor of a specific kind, like was pretty central to it. Like the question of like, correcting certain misapprehensions about what kind of labor art is, it's generally not proletarian labor, whatever, but also like, basically art having some image of an idea of like worth doing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because I felt in this book that was like maybe less of a theme, but it's relevant, I think, to like the first point you're bringing up about the like decline of art world institutions and sort of what contemporary culture, what like creative culture, what like, I mean, I think particularly about stuff on like AI, for instance, it's a question of like, can AI make more novel things? Can AI make things that seem human-like? The question is almost totally approached in how AI is thought of in terms of, what's the product like and how is that product consumed? Not so much like what human capacities might we be at risk of like losing. So I would just be interested in like how you are thinking about that question of like art as labor that's worth doing and the image of art, like where that is in the contemporary things you're describing. Then the other thing about politics is, I mean, I like how you're trying to thread the line between, on the one hand, there's something super limited about, the art kettle, as you also call it, and the way in which, like, the victory of art comes at the expense sometimes of losses in economics and politics in the last generation. But you also emphasize that, we shouldn't be too rapid to, like, as it were, sort of be complicit in the denigrating of the valuation of these institutions because they were for a time and may still have a role in preserving certain kind of insights that are like not, that the general culture is rapidly losing and that politically and economically are on the outs. And it leads me to think, I wonder, again, this is maybe like a vulgar proposition too, but I'm reminded like think there's a talk where Noam Chomsky gave on the environment years ago, and in the Q&A, like, a guy says, you know, as a philosopher, what can I do about the climate crisis? And Noam Chomsky says, absolutely nothing. As a citizen, you know, you can do certain things. You can organize with people, you can get together, you can, you know, protest, you can call representatives, elected representatives, you can get out on the streets. Like, there's all sorts of things you can do, but I don't think there's much you do, especially as a philosopher, on the question of, like, changing the world. I think more or less, like, you do the same things that any other human being in this society does. And I wonder whether, like, part of the solution, and part of the thing I think that maybe, you know, young people are sensitive to in thinking about, like, politics and their work is, like, sure, all of us bring to bear certain kinds of, you know, passions and skills and the like when we enter in politics, but politics is kind of like an autonomous, separate realm that you just engage in as, like, a person, not so much as, like, you know, in your day job, whether that's a good day job maybe of being an artist, or whether that's an alienated day job, an ultra-alienated day job of being an Amazon laborer. It's like politics is something, its own sphere, which I think, yeah, I'm curious what you think about Chomsky's advice.
Well, just some minor little questions about artistic autonomy and, you know, political agency. I sort of, like, like I said earlier about the questions about the where, I don't know, how to define culture, where it comes from. Of course, art as a practice is important and to be defended. And, you know, I defend art school. You know, I'm aware of all the critiques of art school. You know, that it's like, you know, the access questions, the price questions, the professionalization questions. You know, they're, like, really legitimate and good. My experience of art school has, whenever I've taught, has always been like, in a good world, everyone would have this time. You know, everyone would have this time to explore what it means to be a creative individual, or what it means to work with other people creatively. I mean, and that's not a little thing. It's a big thing. I mean, it's part of what sustains people through the ordinary miseries of life in our fallen world. And it's also, you know, it's also like, yeah, literally, you know, it's a cause to fight for. I do think. I just think it's very difficult to talk about art as such, because where people find their disalienated part of their life, I mean, lots of people find it in many different spheres and regions. And as soon as you're talking about any one articulation of the term art, you're already defining, like, categories and classes that are, like, part of, like, the capitalist order as it is instantiated now, which channels certain groups of people with certain kind of privileges and certain kind of backgrounds and wealth and access into certain kinds of culture. I mean, it's just it was just a way to saying, like, I think you just have to hold the two mutually contradictory things in hand, that you can both defend those values and say that they really cannot be fully realized without, like, a different kind of economic order that makes them more available and removes some of the barriers to them that make them because otherwise you end up with this politics where it's like, and I see this in art people all the time, where they get suddenly really upset when art grants are cut, but, like, have nothing to say about any other, you know, kind of thing going on politically. And I just think that there is, yeah, I mean, if you, I would defend, but yeah, art grants is a great question. Like people in the United States really romanticize social democratic art funding, which is good. But on the other hand, go there. I mean, it's like there are very real questions that arise as soon as you ask the question of, yeah, but whose creativity, whose autonomous practice, you know, who's rewarded? as a professional artist worthy of support. Like in the specific material instantiation of these things, and you could say, yeah, everybody should get it, but that's just not the way it is. I mean, these are all things articulated within a situation of scarce resources. So, I've talked long enough. I forget your second one, but you were next, and then you, and then Carrington, and then you. Yeah.
I work at a commercial art gallery, and it seems like right now as like an industry, we're just like waiting for the museum and like institutional art spaces to fall over until we can like kind of take the helm. That's like we're paying lip service and like PR speak to like the importance of the institutions or whatever, if our artists get a work in there or whatever. Do you find any real place for institutions in the future?
Art institutions.
Art institutions, and what are the like drawbacks if commercial galleries kind of
Take over
that spot?
Yeah, I mean, I this is actually really so we were just saying, I mean, yeah, I think the art institutions are more fragile than people think. I experience people tend to view museums as the big bad, and they're actually much more fraught propositions. I mean, it's a real interesting question. I mean, I don't. There's not a lot in this book about institutional politics on that level, because my experience of the last 10 years was really of this third space opening up, where it's like this kind of that's neither the commercial art world nor the nonprofit museum world. Yeah, exactly. But it's this kind of like memification, influencerization of culture, which is a whole other disorienting and weird world. So I mean, I it's really hard to say. I hope that museums would be more of a break on that kind of takeover of just this kind of fully commodified self, art by the kind of fully commodified self. I'm not optimistic about that because, I just reviewed today the AI art show that's currently at MoMA, the Rafik Anadol show, and as far as I'm concerned, like they've given up. And the rhetoric around their show, MoMA is just like ceding so much territory to technology as a center of value. Just like the rhetoric around that show is basically like, there's this kind of digital optimized for the digital world way of thinking about art as like just kind of assets, visual assets, and that's how they're talking about that show. So I think the horse may have already left the stable, but we'll see. It's interesting. Now I want to know what gallery you work for. Over here. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I wanted to respond to something that Jim said.
And please, by the way, respond to each other better as a discussion.
About the place of art and art making in contemporary capital and contemporary culture, and also some comments you made about creativity. But first I have to say, I think I misread the title of your book, because when I saw after culture, I thought, like after party. And the after party is always better than the party, so the after culture is going to be better than the culture.
It could be.
So in old school culture, creativity was a group of people making things, and another group of people who were sensitive or curious or had money consuming them. But I think the success of capitalism isn't the leveling of commodification. The success of capitalism is the leveling of us all to consumers. Mm. And so I think now the place of creativity, the place of resistance, is the resistance to consumerism. And so I think the making of things, that's old-fashioned culture. And so now I think the way one leads an artistic or creative life is in the resistance individually or in communities to, this is an ungodly amount of consumption that we're doing right now. And it's unsustainable for a human life to take all this in and regurgitate, not even regurgitate it, just how did Jonathan Crary and others describe it? We're no longer even spectators. We're more just like archivists, the way we look at things. We're not even experiencing things the way we did in old-fashioned culture.
Sure.
So I think in the after-culture, we'll also have to rethink the place of creativity and what counts as creativity.
Yeah, I think that's really thought-provoking. I'll have to think about it. I mean, on the subject of the afterculture, it's a collection of words I came up with in a notepad looking for a title. But it is also the name of two little short stories that frame the text. And, you know, they are kind of like, you know, a little bit of a positive and negative account of, you know, what culture could look like. Incidentally, Jeremy, it's there in the last part that I think is the part where I most make the case for creative autonomy. And there's a reason why that happens sort of in that little fictional text after the storm or whatever, you know, the big, what do you want to call it, the crisis, whatever crisis is coming on the pike, because for me, and maybe this connects to what you're saying, I was been thinking about, you know, how and when, under what conditions autonomy can be actualized. And I've also been thinking about these questions about environmentalism, about, you know, like, well, how are we going to get there? Because it's a matter of like, because it's a matter of like forming practical coalitions. And when you look at the ideology of the last 30 years of capitalism, like, it's pretty clear that it's been like increasing inequality traded off against cheap consumption. Like, and we keep the plastic stuff coming from China and at cheaper and cheaper prices. And as long as you can have more of that stuff, then you're happy enough with things getting slowly worse. And as long as you can get a hamburger for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, the system is working. And it's clear that level of culture is unsustainable, but it's also clear that it's kind of a political loser to go into political coalition around environmental issues saying, you know, like, your life's going to be worse, less exciting. And so the question for me, sort of the way, you know, Marx is looking for the magic thing that, like, both you could buy and produce more value. Like, artistic autonomy to me is like the magic thing where it's like you can both consume less and like actually experientially have more. You know, we could make the transition towards like a less consumptive, more sustainable planet, but you need to offer something in exchange for that. And to me, it's like, oh, you have your basic needs taken care of. You can become a creative person. You can have you can have more free time, more time to experiment with, you know, what it means to be a human being, and that could technically be less consumptive and more, and therefore the basis of maybe some kind of coalition. That's how I'm sort of thinking about some of those problems. Karen?
Thanks for all your comments and the audience too. But I too was thinking about your title, The Capitalist Crisis and Cultural Strategy, and thinking about what you were saying about art as buffer, and you take the energy from the street. The activists on the street are really angry and they want to say something, and the elite will take that message and be like, great, and they'll like help channel it into the arts where it's kind of neutered, right? And I wonder if, like, the cultural strategy part is like, how do artists not play this role? So sort of like what Jeremy was talking about, like with Chomsky, like maybe the philosopher's role is not to accept that role, like not to be the cultural buffer. And the strategic thinking comes in to like, well, how do you do that? Because you want to make a living, right, with your art. So then do you take the Gramsci approach of writing code? Like, like do you become like an artist in code and like think about how you can bring your art instead of taking the message from the street, like taking it back to the street, and that way you can be of public service. And that's sort of what you're kind of getting at in your subtitle, because I see that as like a call to activism.
Yeah, I mean, I try. I mean, I don't know. I'm not crazy about something myself, but I just wanted to. I was looking for. I was trying to get my publisher to accept the title, but I also, it's not. The book is about art narrowly so defined and broadly so defined. A lot of the chapters 5 through 8 are not really about art world art at all. They're about like culture more broadly, about online theorizing, kind of online organizing, about cultural appropriation, about conspiracy theories, and about how culture relates to questions of the environment. So I was trying to convey that a little bit more. I mean, what is to be done? How do how do artists relate to this? Is always what it comes back to. I mean, I tend to think, we should be lucky that we have this room where we could talk about these ideas and these questions, and that's not a small historical thing. And I think we should be able to think about it as both, because I see all this cynicism about the art as a context, and one should be cynical about it, obviously, but then you also see countries like Poland, for instance, where it's like there's a right wing in power that's really like, get the left shit out of our art, and then you're like, whoa, maybe we should have not taken that so much for granted. It's not like that couldn't happen, And so you do need to have a little bit of a living perspective on it that is, holds the idea of elite capture in the lens, but also sees it as like a resource to be used. Within the kind of like organizing milieu where you and I met, I guess one of the things I like to say is that I think it's very easy, to be cynical about art as a symbolic, the kind of virtual signaling critique, and there's all this kind of stuff in the galleries that just feels really phony, and so on, and often really is. Although, to who? Everybody has their first political. You never know where the first time someone picks up a reference is, and where it is. And what I thought is that you really do have to have a dialectical approach to it. That the weaknesses of art politics, which are that it's light, right? People are always going to fund an art show about a problem before they. Rich people are going to fund an art show about the problem before they do something about the problem. It's just that's the buffer role. Those are the weaknesses of it. However, you also have to realize, particularly if you're interested in an organizing project, that the weaknesses of culture as a form of politics are also its strengths, in the sense that nobody starts at the center of the problem. Everybody enters through a direction, and it's the fact that it's a lower lift to go to a poster show, to go to a work of political theater or an art show, punk rock show, hip hop show, that they have, that it's not sitting in a sitting in a crowded church basement, or more realistically on Zoom, talking about, really instrumental things, about getting people to some event, or that's a higher ask of people than the cultural stuff. And so you should actually embrace the critique of art as, that it's like a lightweight politics. It's a lightweight thing that allows it to bring people in. People pass through those things. So the question isn't really, cultural stuff or not cultural stuff. It's just how is it articulated? Is it? And I personally think that for all the reasons we've just been talking about, there's a lot of hunger for community out there, intellectual community, social solidarity, because our lives are been just completely chewed up by probably all know the studies about everybody's declining number of close personal friends, and so on. So and that's a product of capitalism views time on screen as a commodity, and every every time you leave that screen to spend uncommodified time with a friend, that's time they're not serving you an ad. So there's a real way that it's the building of communities of affiliation outside of those things, both a cultural and a political project, and I think we should be really interested in. Did you have a thing back there? And I should say we're at 8, but I'm happy to keep talking, but people can leave if it is hot in here. If you want a book, goes to an independent publisher, I'm happy to sign it or whatever. Yeah.
Maybe just do one more.
Maybe do one more? Okay. Well, I'll do one more and then I'll just be here. How about that?
I guess I just had a question about, because you've been talking about like the oversaturation of the
Sorry?
online market. Like the oversaturation of like art online, how it's just constantly a stream of content that you're meant to consume, because basically the corporations that are the media companies, social media basically want your attention, so it's just whatever it gets the most clicks and most attention. I feel like one of the ways that people create brands for themselves in like a fundamentally alienated way is like having their own persona, and I feel like it kind of
Their own persona what?
like their persona, like artistic style is like put above everything else, and like it's frowned upon generally as a creator online to like branch out into different things because you might lose your audience. And so I feel like that's another way that the market sort of like, I don't know, like perhaps like corrodes like artistic connection online, just because like your entire personhood as like a creator is being monetized rather than only the art you make. So I feel like there's 2 layers to that.
Yeah.
But like that said, do you think that there's any way that like the internet can be used like more positive way towards that sort of creation?
I don't know, and I wouldn't venture to answer. I mean, the chapter here called "The Anarchist and Network," which looks at some of these questions of relationship to political stuff, where I think you have basically the same problem, where once you've turned political content into a form of boutique business, you have the problem that in order to maintain your brand differentiation is always about uniqueness, and that means that it makes solidarity very difficult, because you always have to be like, in order just to like keeping people subscribing to you and not the other person, you constantly have to be like picking fights to like differentiate yourself. I think there's something to that that's a real element. There are artists exploring this. I am involved in, there are a variety of artists who are like looking at, who are thinking about how people form affiliations. I think it's a absolute. It's a big creative question. I mean, I don't. And the thing, and this is. I mean, I'll just say a methodological thing to wrap up, which is that, like, and it is one thing to like have a critique of the way the media functions now, and the way Instagram or just social media functions, or the whole thing, and to be like, well, that's, this is such degraded culture, and it's corrupt and has all these bad incentives of it, and it is easy to have that, to maintain the position of what Hegel would call the beautiful soul, that like up until the point where you have a book to promote, or artwork to promote, or a cause to promote. And I see this all the time in my work, because I work for a website, ArtNet News, which is like really frenetic and exhausting, and all the pathologies that I've described, I learn about them from the inside there. And, people, including myself, look down on a lot of that content. And up until the point when like some, serious intellectual has a book to promote, and they write you and saying, like, please write about this, because there's so many declining avenues of actually getting ideas out there, and you do have to kind of like, and we're gonna all have to face this question with AI there are that's why the word strategy is in the title, because I think you need a strategic approach to a lot of these things. Like there is like not a moral approach, there's like a way that you have to look at the objectives that you're trying to serve. In some sense, I feel like, a lot of the cultural energy is closest to where the tire hits the road. The energy is released closer to the tire hits the road. So it's like, in the most degraded, the most degraded forms of culture are where they're going to be feeling the contradictions most intensely, and it's perfectly worth engaging there. If the left isn't engaging there, the right definitely will be. So you can't necessarily step outside of that. So you really do have to walk on both feet and both be trying to preserve, the idea of artistic autonomy and some kind of resistance to all these ways that our cultural life is completely dominated. But like I said in the part where I was talking about Roberta Smith versus Taylor Lorenz, the way I just think that people don't understand how dominated we are, essentially. That by the time people are formulating a critique to a lot of these cultural forms, it's already here. You're arguing about something that has already happened. People have formed communities around it, and that's lamentable. But it's also realistic. I mean, it's what is the goal? The goal of the art, good culture, doesn't really align with some other good objectives, and you're just constantly navigating how you put these things together in these half-satisfying formations that will be half-satisfying and broken until the world is fixed. And that's just it. That's just what it is. So.